The Industrial Revolution. First of all, we're going to discuss why Britain was first to industrialize. So why was Britain first? F-I-R-S-T. First of all, they had funds from the colonies. You need funds in order for industrialization to be able to happen. So a large capitalist system in Great Britain allowed for a great money flow, and of course they controlled a lot of colonies around the world. During the Victorian age, they will actually control roughly 25% of the world's real estate, and that will be very beneficial to them to help aid in industrialization, mechanizing industry. They had inventions. Because of the funds, they were allowed to innovate and come up with new inventions like the seed drill that we talked about before, as well as the steam engine that will help aid industrialization. Eventually, that steam engine could be applied to any kind of new machine that would be invented that could be powered with steam power. This will help the factory system to develop. Resources are. They had an abundance of natural resources at their disposal that helped to fuel industrialization. Not only did they have natural resources like water and coal to help power machines, they also had access to natural resources to help, especially in the textile industry, which became one of the major industries of Great Britain, and in particular cotton cloth. Even though you couldn't grow cotton in England, it's too cold, too wet, it could grow easily in parts of the Colonial Empire that Great Britain controlled. So, resources in abundance. Stability. They had a very stable government, and economically they were stable, especially compared to other nations on the European continent. We have discussed the stability of the government in England. We've talked about the constitutional monarchy, the parliamentary system with the two-party system. We'll continue to talk more about that as well. And of course, trade. Trade with its empire, which was protected by the Great British Navy, also aided industrialization. You had to be able to trade those goods that you produce in order to bring more money into your country that could then fuel even more industrialization. So, why was Britain first to industrialize? F-I-R-S-T, funds, inventions, resources, stability of the government and the economy, and trade. Key concept. The Industrial Revolution has two themes. Theme 1 we'll deal with in this audio lecture. Debatably, the Industrial Revolution was the most important development in human history in the last 10,000 years. The Industrial Revolution radically altered the European economy by providing steam power for factory production and transportation developments. The textile, coal, and iron industries were at the heart of the revolution. Overview of the Industrial Revolution. Machines began to replace significantly human and animal power in the production and manufacturing of goods. The steam engine for producing textiles in the 1780s will be the turning point of this, replacing the cottage industry with the factory system. Europe gradually transitioned from an agricultural and commercial society into a modern industrial society. As late as the 1830s, only a small fraction of British working people were employed in factories. But by the mid-19th century, industrialism had spread all across Europe. It happened in less than a century. The economic changes of the Industrial Revolution did more than any other movement to revolutionize life in Europe and Western civilization. Not since the development of the agriculture during the Neolithic times had there been such a radical change in society and how people lived their lives. The roots of the Industrial Revolution can be found in what we have discussed in the previous units in this class. First of all, the commercial revolution between 1500 and 1800. It spurred economic growth of Europe and brought about the age of exploration. That also brought about the price revolution that stimulated production of goods. The rise of capitalism is a result of that as well. Surplus money was used for investment in ventures to make a profit. The middle class provided leadership for the economic revolution in the way of charter and joint stock companies. The scientific revolution also produced the first wave of mechanical inventions and technological advances that will eventually be applied to industry. The increase in Europe's population also provided larger markets for these goods, which also increased the demand for these goods. Proto-Industrialization, or the cottage industry that we discussed in Unit 5, was also a cause of this. Rural industry was fundamental to the growing economy in the 18th century. The cottage industry, as we learned, was where merchant capitalists provided raw materials to rural families who then produced finished or semi-finished products and sent it back to the merchants for the payment of a wage. The merchants then sold those goods for a profit in the marketplace. During this time, wool cloth was the most important, but eventually that will switch to cotton. Problems, however, did come about with the cottage industry as time went on. First of all, there were constant disputes between the cottagers and the merchants over weights of materials and the quality of the cloth being produced. Rural labor was also unorganized and difficult for merchants to control. Merchant capitalists thus searched for more efficient methods, and this will result in the growth of the factory system and the Industrial Revolution. So if you take the previous few slides, you see causation of the Industrial Revolution, which, remember, is one of the big themes in the historical thinking skills that we cover in AP European History, and that will be covered in the writing sections of the AP European History exam in May. The cottage industry flourished first in England, so it makes sense that the factory system will come about in England first as well. Proto-industrialization technology, prior to the steam engine, consisted of several of the inventions that we discussed in Unit 5. In 1733, John Kay produced the flying shuttle to help with the loom process of weaving cloth. In 1764, James Hargreaves invented the spinning jenny, which mechanized the spinning wheel. In 1769, Richard Arkwright invented the water frame, which improved thread spinning, making it possible for several hundred spindles to be produced on a machine that ran on water power rather than being powered by human activity. It required large specialized factories that employed as many as 1,000 workers to house these larger machines. In 1779, Samuel Crompton invented the spinning mule, which combined the best features of the spinning jenny and the water frame together. This resulted in all cotton spinning gradually being done in factories. Key concept. England was the first country to industrialize, also known as Britain. This began in earnest in the 1780s, but it would not be complete until the 1830s at the earliest. Industrialization really had no impact on the continent until after the Napoleonic Wars, largely because they were otherwise occupied with that warfare. Economic and social factors. First of all, England's land and geography must be considered as one of the factors as to why it was first to industrialize. England's geographic isolation from the continent offered it protection. It was an island country, and although it was participating in the Napoleonic Wars, none of the wars were being fought on English soil. They also had a good supply of coal and iron in England. Waterways offered a source of alternate power for factories like the water frame and navigable transport for trade and communication. No part of England was more than 20 miles away from navigable water. It was much cheaper to ship goods by water than by land, and this benefited England greatly. The Industrial Revolution grew out of England's expanding role in the Atlantic economy of the 18th century that we discussed in a prior unit as well. The growth of the Royal Navy and the development of ports provided protection from foreign invasion and aided Britain's commercial empire. The Agricultural Revolution was vital to the Industrial Revolution as well. The revolution in agriculture made it possible for fewer farmers to feed larger numbers of people. The British population doubled in the 18th century as a result of that enclosure movement, as well as the revolution in agriculture with fertilization, crop rotation, etc. Again, refer to Unit 5. The demand for goods within the country increased as the population increased. More people were now freed up to work in factories or in the distribution of other goods and services because they were not needed for agricultural production. People moved around in search of land or other forms of employment. Key concept. Large supplies of capital were available in England due to over 2 centuries of profitable commercial activity, starting with the age of exploration and the establishment of an Atlantic trade. The government in England established the Bank of England in 1694. This would be the country's central bank. Insurance companies like Lloyd's of London provided some degree of protection from commercial failure as well. This fostered the rise of entrepreneurs or businessmen who started new businesses. They were willing to take the risk of taking out a loan, thinking that it would pay off in the long run. And it did. The entrepreneurs were a class of inventive and highly motivated inventors, engineers, and capitalists, all who possessed technological skill and were willing to take the risks. Many young men from the gentry class in England undertook careers in business. The middle class could rise into the nobility from the wealth created in business as a result in England. This was not the case in many other countries in Europe, largely due to the Napoleonic Wars going on in Europe. Calvinists in the middle class also were driven by the Protestant work ethic that we discussed in an earlier unit. The Colonial Empire of England. It gave Britain access to raw materials that were needed for the development of many industries. The growing market for English goods occurred in its colonies, buttressed by the African slave trade. Key concept. Britain's parliamentary government promoted commercial and industrial interests because those interests were represented in Parliament. As more and more of these new gentry, who were businessmen, were being elected to the House of Commons in England, they were the ones making decisions that would benefit themselves and others like them. Well-established financial institutions, like the Bank of England, were ready to make loans available to entrepreneurs willing to go into business and to start a new commercial venture. Limited monarchy in England, because they had a constitutional monarchy, meant that the government did not stifle the growth and expansion of the middle class like the governments in absolute monarchies did in other European nations. All of these will be reasons why Great Britain is the first to industrialize. England also had a very stable government. The successful outcome of wars did not leave England devastated, as was the case with the Napoleonic Wars for many of those other European nations. The rise of the House of Commons and the influence of the House of Commons became an instrument of the middle class to gain government cooperation for their economic ventures, and secured the middle class loyalty to that parliament. In contrast, the French middle classes had led revolutionary movements. In England, there was no need to do that because they had already achieved their power being recognized in the English Parliament through the House of Commons. Parliamentary legislation was favorable towards the growth of industry and business. The repeal of the Bubble Act, again, allowed for the creation of joint stock companies. The repeal of the Navigation Acts and the Corn Laws, discussed in earlier units, decreased mercantilism's stifling effect on certain industries as well, basically creating a more free economy, a more laissez-faire economy in England. Remember what laissez-faire means. The government keeps its hands off of the economy, letting it govern itself through the natural laws of supply and demand. The steam engine's application to textile production in England was perhaps the key event of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1780s, Richard Arkwright used the steam engine to power looms and required factory production of textiles. In 1784, Edmund Cartwright invented a loom that was powered by horses, water, or steam. Metallurgical industries flourished as they provided the machinery needed for these industries. Steam engines and coal. The use of coal to power steam engines was one of the hallmarks of the Industrial Revolution. The revolution in energy involved a transition from wood burning to coal burning. Coal provided steam power used in many industries, and it was far more efficient than wood burning. Coal could burn much longer than wood. It did not burn as quickly, but it burned a lot more hot than wood burning. By 1850, England produced 2/3 of the world's coal. The steam engine. Thomas Savery, 1698, and Thomas Newcomen in 1705 both invented steam pumps to remove water from mines. Both engines were extremely inefficient, however. They were used to replace mechanical pumps that were powered by animals, but it was a step in the right direction. Eventually, it gives way to James Watt, who invented and patented the first efficient steam engine in 1769. By the late 1780s, this steam engine was perfected even more and used regularly in production in England. The steam engine was the most fundamental advance in technology. The use of steam could power any machine. Radical transformations occurred in manufacturing and in transportation as a result to steam power coming about. The iron industry was radically transformed by steam power as well. The rising supplies of coal in England boosted iron production, and gave rise to heavy industry. Heavy industry is the manufacture of machinery and materials used in production of machines that could be used to produce other goods. Iron makers switched over rapidly from charcoal to coke in the smelting of pig iron as well. Henry Court in the 1780s developed the puddling furnace, which refined pig iron with coke. Court also developed heavy-duty steam-powered rolling mills capable of shaping finished iron into any shape or form. The idea behind puddling was to clean the impurities out of the pig iron using coke, which could burn very hot, to burn the impurities out of the iron. And that made for stronger iron if it didn't have the impurities in it. By 1850, England produced more than half of the world's iron. Transportation revolution was another result of the Industrial Revolution in England, as well as the use of steam power. It was made possible by that steam power. It became necessary to distribute finished goods and to deliver raw materials to factories. New canal systems were important in completing the basic needs of related interdependent industries: railroad, steel, and coal. The construction of hard surface roads, however, significantly improved land travel. Steamboats were another byproduct of this. In 1807, Robert Fulton's steamboat, the Clermont, traveled upriver from New York City to Albany in the United States. He used an imported Boulton and Watt steam engine to power this boat. It made a two-way river travel possible and travel on the high seas much faster. You could travel upriver against the current fairly easily now. In 1838, the first steamship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. That's fairly quick, folks. 1807 was when it was invented. 1838, the first steamship crossed the Atlantic Ocean. Now, railroads were the big, I guess you would say, winner in use of steam power for transportation. Railroads, also known as the Iron Horse. In 1803, the first steam wagon was used on the streets of London. In 1812, the steam wagon was adapted for use on rails that were laid down along the ground. In 1825, George Stephenson made the railroad locomotive commercially successful. By 1829, it was widely used throughout England 4 short years. In 1830, his locomotive, called the Rocket, traveled the Liverpool-Manchester Railway at a whopping 16 miles per hour. Now, I know that doesn't sound very quick to us, but it was rather quick from, what they could have with horses that would grow weary and grow tired and slow down. This could be a consistent 16 miles per hour. This was the world's first important railroad, as it was in the heart of industrial England. The opening of the Liverpool-Manchester Railroad in 1830 can be seen here in the painting. The line became the world's first intercity railway and led to a huge wave of railroad building throughout England. Many private companies were quickly organized to build more rail lines in the 1840s. The impact of the railroad is very significant, not just in England, but all over. But we're discussing England first. The impact greatly reduced the cost of shipping freight on land. It resulted in a growing regional and national market, spurring increased industrial productivity to meet larger demand for those products. It also facilitated the growth of an urban working class who came from the countryside in search of work. Many cottage workers, farm laborers, and small peasants worked at building railroads in the off seasons. After the rail lines were built, many traveled on railroads to towns looking for work in the factories. Honore Daumier was a painter who illustrated the mobility of peasants using the railroad. As you see in his painting, The Third Class Carriage from 1862, a grandmother sits with her daughter and grandchildren on a railroad, on a rail car. British industrial supremacy by 1850. Great Britain produced 2/3 of the world's coal by that point. It produced over half of the world's iron by that point, and it produced more than half of the world's cotton cloth. The GNP was up by 350% between 1801 and 1850 in England. 100% growth between 1780 and 1800 occurred in England. The population increased from 9 million in 1780 to 21 million in 1851. That's only 70 years, folks. Per capita income increased almost 100% between 1801 and 1851. And the economy increased faster than population growth, ultimately creating higher demand for labor. Relative levels of industrialization between 1750 and 1900, you can see the United Kingdom is at the top on this chart. The Crystal Palace was built for the 1851 International Exhibit. It was intended to signify Britain's industrial, economic, and military power. It was also considered to be the first World's Fair to show off British dominance in industry as well as British dominance in empire. Key concept. Now, continental Europe began to industrialize more after 1815 with the defeat of Napoleon Bonaparte. Parts of the continent had not been far behind Great Britain in the 1780s, but the Napoleonic Wars hindered economic growth on the continent. Wars disrupted trade, created runaway inflation, and reduced consumer demand. Continental access to British machinery and technology was also reduced during the Napoleonic Wars. After 1815, continental Europe began to catch up to Britain industrially. They studied Britain's costly mistakes during the early Industrial Revolution and tried to avoid them. They learned from Great Britain's mistakes. Industrialization differed in each country after 1850, however. Belgium, Holland, France, and the U.S. began their industrial revolutions in the second decade of the 19th century. Germany, Austria, and Italy industrialized in the mid-19th century. By 1900, Germany was the most powerful industrial country in Europe, replacing Great Britain as the most important industrial nation. Eastern Europe and Russia, however, were slower to industrialize. They industrialized near the end of the 19th century, but not nearly as extensively as Western Europe. And that would put Eastern Europe and Russia behind the 8 ball, so to speak, at the dawn of the 20th century when the world wars are approaching. Continental countries often use the power of strong sovereign central governments and banking systems to promote native industries. Belgium, in the 1830s, pioneered the organization of big corporations with many stockholders. Banks used money to develop industries and thus became industrial banks. Key concept. France moved toward industrialization at a more gradual pace than Great Britain, with government support and with less dislocation of traditional methods of production. Banks in France and in Germany became important in the 1850s in developing railroads and companies in heavy industries. Credit Mobilier of Paris was the most famous of these companies. It helped build railroads all over France and other parts of Europe. Britain was unsuccessful in maintaining a monopoly on those technological advances that they started. Until 1825, it was illegal for artisans and skilled mechanics to leave Great Britain. They were trying to keep the knowledge in their own country, but that didn't last. Until 1843, the export of textile machinery and other equipment was also forbidden. Yet, many Brits immigrated illegally and introduced these new methods abroad, trying to make a way for themselves. Key concept. Tariff policies were used to protect native industries on the continent. France enacted high tariffs on many British goods. France had been flooded by inexpensive and superior British goods that ultimately hurt French industry. In 1834, the Zollverein was a German tariff on non-German imports established to encourage capital investment in German industry at home. It established a free trade zone among member states, and a single uniform tariff was levied against foreign countries to import their goods. It was later strengthened through the ideas of Friedrich List and his ideas in National System of Political Economy, his book. We'll talk more about that later. The most significant result of this was increased production and availability of manufactured goods within Prussia, Germany. This chart shows you the per capita levels of industrialization between 1750 and 1913 of the states listed. You can see that Western Europe, as well as the United States, were far ahead of other nations in Central Europe and in Eastern Europe, and then those in Asia, at least at the time. Key concept, talking about the differences that happen in everyday lives because of industrial. Another key concept, and another key concept. We're starting Industrial Revolution Theme 2 now. The Industrial Revolution dramatically altered European society by spurring urbanization, meaning people moving from the countryside to the cities, sparking the continued rise of the middle class, utilizing the massive growth of the proletariat, or working class. That word is a word that we will come into contact with more as we move into the mid-19th century with Marxism. Also, the Industrial Revolution reconfigured family work arrangements and gender roles. As a result, numerous challenges to the new order emerged. Social effects of the Industrial Revolution. It replaced the traditional social hierarchy with a new social order. The 19th century became the golden age of the middle class. A new class of factory owners emerged in this period, and they will be referred to as the bourgeoisie. Now, I know we've used that word before, just referring to upper middle class businessmen, but in particular, we are focusing on the factory owners, the owners of the means of production, with this word in this era. There were two levels of bourgeoisie that existed. The upper bourgeoisie were the big businessmen, the Donald Trumps, if you will, before he was president, when he was just a businessman. Great bankers, merchants, and industrialists. They were ones that demanded free enterprise and high tariffs. They wanted free enterprise, meaning no government involvement in the economy. They didn't want the government to regulate their businesses at all. Laissez-faire. The lower bourgeoisie, also known as the petite bourgeoisie, were the smaller industrialists, the smaller merchants, like smaller shops, and professional men who demanded stability and security from the government. They also liked laissez-faire, but they actually wanted it tempered a little bit. They didn't want the government to be completely out of the equation because they wanted the government to help them level the playing field between themselves and the larger industrialists. Eventually, there will be a split in the bourgeoisie because of these differences. New opportunities for certain groups also emerged because of the Industrial Revolution. Artisans and skilled workers who were highly talented achieved significant success. Certain ethnic and religious groups became successful as well. Quakers and Scots in England became extremely successful with woodworking and other things. Protestants and Jews dominated banking in Catholic France because Protestants and Jews did not have laws against charging interest. As factories grew larger, opportunities for advancement declined in well-developed industries, however. Capital-intensive industry made it harder for skilled artisans to become wealthy manufacturers, and instead, most of them ended up moving into the regular working class, having to give up their skilled work to work in factories with unskilled labor. Formal education thus became more important as a means of social advancement, but the cost was often prohibitive to those below the middle class. In England by 1830 and in Germany in 1860, leading industrialists were more likely to have inherited their businesses rather than started them on their own, inherited them from their parents. Proletariat wage earners, or regular working class. Factory workers emerged as a new group in society and the fastest growing social class, known as the proletariat. In the first century of the Industrial Revolution, a surplus of labor resulted in poor conditions for the workers. If you have more competition for the jobs, then the conditions go down. It's just like supply and demand in the marketplace for commodities. Work hours in factories were as much as 14 hours a day, occasionally more. There were few holidays for workers as well. Working conditions were often brutal and unsafe. Low wages persisted, particularly for women and children. And poorhouses emerged to provide work to those who were unemployed, and conditions were very poor there. The poorhouses were kind of run by the governments, the local governments, as a way to deal with the unemployed. And being put in a poorhouse was almost like being put in a prison. You had to report there daily. You had to work very difficult labor, and you maybe would get a bowl of gruel or mush for your time. A cartoon here criticizing the greed of capitalists and how they allegedly exploited their workers during the Industrial Revolution. You see behind in the background there, industrialists with whips and the workers chained together. The issues of working conditions, wages, and the quality of life led to struggles between labor and capital. For workers and ordinary families, the long-term impact of the Industrial Revolution was more favorable than negative. However, the negatives were so egregious that they often get a great deal of attention by historians. It constituted a significant advancement, however, overall, from the pattern of pre-industrial life. Material prosperity in England increased due to the availability of cheaper, high-quality goods, and because it increased consumption, led to more jobs. Wages. This is where we see a real issue emerge eventually. Between 1820 and 1850, however, real wages and consumption of the average worker rose by almost 50% to what it had been in pre-industrial levels. However, the average work week, the hours worked, increased. Workers ate better, and the quality and quantity of clothing improved overall. Housing did not improve, however, for working people, and in fact, it may have deteriorated somewhat until the later 19th century. When they all start moving into the cities looking for jobs, slums emerge for housing that were built very quickly, most of them not very sanitary, and ultimately crowded conditions led to cholera outbreaks, crime, and other issues. But as a whole, until 1850, workers did not proportionately share in the general wealth produced by the Industrial Revolution. The majority of the wealth would be in that upper middle class, the bourgeoisie. As technology improved, many would lose jobs to the machines. This means as more better machines were built that could do more of the work, less workers were actually needed to run the machines. So eventually, they will be replaced by bigger and better machines. Workers will be replaced, and again, then you have more unemployed and all the problems that go along with that, crime, etc. Now, the Luddites. The Luddites were a violent group of irate workers who blamed industrialism for threatening their jobs. As more and more of these machines were built that required less and less workers to run them, they started to see the machines as the enemy, these Luddites. Beginning in 1812 and continuing thereafter, the Luddites would attack factories in northern England, destroying the new machines they believed were putting them out. Key concept. This will eventually lead to things like the union movement. Certain leaders began organizing groups of workers to resist exploitation of the proletariat by business owners. The Combination Acts of 1799. Parliament prohibited labor unions to be created with these acts. This makes sense if you think about the fact that the majority of those who are being elected to the House of Commons in Parliament were now members of the upper bourgeoisie. They were ones that wanted to pass legislation that benefited themselves and others like them, rather than prohibit their growth of their businesses. Allowing unions, the workers to organize into unions, would ultimately not benefit the bourgeoisie, because of course the unions are going to demand better wages, better conditions, better working hours, and those kinds of things, which ultimately cuts into the profit margin for the bourgeoisie. So the reaction, this was a reaction to the fear of radicalism in the French Revolution. They worried that unions ultimately would lead to rebellions, and so they justified the denying of labor unions because of that. This was widely disregarded by workers, however, and they continued to meet even though they would not be official unions. They continued to organize themselves. Eventually, the Combination Acts were repealed in 1824, and unions became more tolerated after 1825 in England. Robert Owen, 1771 to 1858, is an important individual. In 1834, he organized the Grand National Consolidated Trades Union. He himself was an industrialist, a Scottish industrialist, who actually founded a labor union. He combined firm discipline with a concern for the health, safety, and work hours of his workers. He was a forward-thinking bourgeoisie, more so than the traditional bourgeoisie, who did not want to help the workers because were concerned about it cutting into their profit margin. Robert Owen believed that a well cared for worker, a happier worker, would be a more productive worker. So he was a little different than some of the other industrialists. His and other unionization efforts failed, however, and the British labor movement moved once again after 1851 in the direction of craft unions. It was a good attempt. He will have other attempts at other reforms as well, as we will talk about later in another lecture. After 1815, he experimented with utopian cooperative socialist communities, and that's what we'll talk about in another lecture. Craft unions won benefits for their members. Skilled workers' means were fairly conservative and were an accepted part of industry. Unions campaigned for 10-hour workdays instead of 14, and to permit duty-free imports of wheat into Britain to secure cheap bread. This was in response to the oppressive corn laws that had been passed in 1815. We discussed the corn laws before, talking about how it restricted the importation of grain products, all grain products, into Great Britain in order to protect the British farmer. The British farmers' prices could remain falsely high if they didn't have to compete with foreign grain coming in and lowering the cost because the supply went up. Eventually, we will see unions campaigning for an end to the corn laws so they can have more wheat, more grain coming in to England at cheaper prices because, of course, remember, supply and demand. If there's more supply, the price goes down, and it will benefit the workers in the long run. We'll talk more about the corn laws later. Union action, combined with general prosperity and a developing social conscience, led to improved working conditions, better wages, and reduced work hours in some industries. But this would not be widespread. It would really not be outside of England either. Skilled labor benefited earlier and to a larger extent than unskilled labor. Skilled labor seemed to be doing better because they were better able to organize themselves. However, there were fewer skilled laborers and more unskilled laborers. So it's the unskilled laborers that will be the worse off as a result of the changes that come about because of the Industrial Revolution. We'll continue to talk about that as well. Key concept: changes in working conditions. Factory work meant more discipline and loss of personal freedom. Work became impersonal. Early factories resembled English poorhouses, where destitute people went to live on welfare. Some poorhouses were industrial prisons even. Child labor exploitation was also an issue. Causes for increased child labor. More agricultural workers became weavers as they were paid relatively well compared to agricultural work, especially after the enclosure movement in England. English factories scared off many potential workers as they resembled the poorhouses. And so oftentimes it would be the children that would be employed as a result. Factory owners thus turned to the child labor as a cheap way to get work. Abandoned children became a main source of labor from local parishes and orphanages. If anybody has ever read the book Oliver Twist by Charles Dickens, that story, of course, deals with these abandoned children who are forced to work. Owners exercised authority over children, much like slave owners. Work hours were very long, and conditions were appalling. Children worked as chimney sweeps, market girls, and shoemakers. Child exploitation was not new, however. Conditions were similar to the cottage industry. Child labor was ending as the Industrial Revolution matured, however. Oftentimes, children would be hired by factory owners so they wouldn't have to power down a machine when it became jammed. If you have to power down a machine, you have to wait for it to power down. You have to send somebody in to unjam the machine. Then you have to power the machine back up again. The steam power takes time to build to get restarted. If you could send a child into the machine, crawling into the machine because they were small, and unjam the machine without having to turn the whole system off, it could save you money. However, it was dangerous for the child. They oftentimes lost limbs in the process when the machine was unjammed and came back on. Parents and children typically worked at least 12-hour days, but as we said before, sometimes upwards of 14 and more. Many families were unwilling to let their family be separated. In cotton mills, children worked for mothers or fathers collecting waste and piecing broken thread together. In mines, children sorted coal and worked ventilation equipment, the pumps to ventilate air down into the mine shafts, the coal mine shafts. Adult workers were not necessarily eager to limit the minimum working age or hours of their children, as long as they worked together. If their child could be paid for working alongside the parent, the whole family could benefit, could have more money coming into the household. Yet, parents did protest inhumane treatment of their children. Key concept. Parliament sought to limit child labor over time. The Sadler Committee investigated working conditions and helped initiate legislation to improve conditions in factories. This will eventually lead to the passing of the Factory Act of 1833 by Parliament. This limited the workday for children ages 9 to 13 to only 8 hours per day. It limited hours of children 14 to 18 to 12 hours per day. And it prohibited the hiring of children under the age of 9. Children instead were to go to elementary schools that factory owners were required to establish for them. Ironically, this helped destroy the pattern of families working together, ultimately. Employment of children declined rapidly in England as a result of these initiations. Mines Act of 1842 was another one passed by Parliament. It prohibited all boys and girls under the age of 10 from working underground in the coal mines. Also, we have the 10 Hours Act of 1847 that restricted the hours of women and children in textile factories to only 10 hours per day. If you look at this drawing down below, you see children were often used to haul coal up through very narrow mine shafts in the coal mines because they could fit. And of course, the working conditions were terrible as a result of this. It led to the deaths of many children. Of course, the inhaling of the coal smoke, etc., led to death. Just terrible conditions. Key concept. The social effects of industrialism now need to be discussed. Urbanization was one of the things mentioned in a previous slide. It was the most important sociological effect of the Industrial Revolution. It was the largest population transfer in human history, transferring from the countryside to the cities. The birth of factory towns, cities that grew into large industrial centers happened as well. Manchester is a perfect example of this. We'll be doing some more work with an activity about the growth of industrial cities at a later time, as well as some writing exercises over this phenomenon. In 1785, there were only three cities with more than 50,000 people that existed in England and Scotland. But by 1820, 31 British cities had 50,000 or more people living in them. The role of the city changed in the 19th century from governmental and cultural centers to industrial centers. Although living conditions did not differ much from those on farms, the concentration of the population made them appear worse because they were living in such close proximity to each other, right on top of each other. The conditions seemed very poor. Disease and waste in the street, dirty living conditions, just crime, those kinds of things. Key concept. Key concept. Working class injustices, gender exploitation, and the standard of living issues became the 19th century's biggest social dilemmas. And these will all lead to things like the rise of socialism. The family structure and gender roles within the family were completely altered because of industrialization. Productive work was taken out of the home. As factory wages for skilled adult males rose, women and children were separated from the workplace. Gender-determined roles at home and domestic life emerged slowly for the bourgeoisie as well. Married women in the bourgeoisie class, remember those are the business owners class, married women came to be associated with domestic duties. Men often were the sole wage earner as a result. Now, if you think about during the medieval period and even the Renaissance period, with the bourgeoisie, there were a great number of wives of bourgeoisie that worked alongside their husbands in their shops, in their small businesses. But now these women were to stay home, to take care of the children only, to not have anything to do with the business. And we eventually have the emergence of what is known as the cult of domesticity. Women were now expected to create a nurturing environment in the home. This is remember, the middle class women, not the working class women. A nurturing environment to which family members returned to after work. Key concept. Key concept. Irish workers increasingly came to Great Britain and became urban workers. Overpopulation and rural poverty was most severe in Ireland, and this resulted in massive migration out of Ireland. Many Irish were forced out of rural Ireland by population growth and increasingly poor economic conditions, especially by the mid-1800s with the emergence of the Irish potato famine. So much starvation happened because of the potato blight that they had to find other places to go to try to survive. Many will go to the English cities that have factories. Many will even migrate across the ocean to the United States. The Irish potato famine in the 1840s. The population was mostly Irish Catholic peasants that moved. They rented land from a tiny minority of Anglicans, many of whom lived in England. Most lived in abject poverty around 1800, and the Protestant landlords did not improve agriculture in Ireland. This made the situation worse when the disease hit the potato crop and wiped out most of the potato crops in Ireland. Disease in the potato crop increased along with human fever epidemics. In 1845 and 1846, and again in 1848 and 1851, the potato crop failed in Ireland and in much of Europe. Higher food prices, widespread suffering, and social unrest ensued. Remember, Europe had become very dependent on the potato. We've talked about this before. Ireland in particular. Results, about 1.5 million died, or babies were never born, died stillbirth as a result of this starvation. 1 million also fled Ireland between 1845 and 1851. 2 million more left between 1840 and 1855, if you look at that time period. It's a lot of people. So 1.5 million dead and 2 million leaving Ireland. The British government's response to the crisis was inadequate. Now, the historical debate on the Industrial Revolution. Capitalists view it as a positive step toward fulfilling human wants and needs, as a byproduct of the Age of Reason, of the idea of laissez-faire that came from the physiocrats like Adam Smith. The Industrial Revolution, according to the capitalists, provided power to replace back-breaking human labor. Wealth was now available for human consumption, and human consumption will increase as a result of that. Vast amounts of food, clothing, and energy were produced and distributed to workers of the world. Luxuries were made commonplace. Life expectancy increased. Leisure time made life more enjoyable. And these were all positives, but human catastrophe, like what happened due to the Irish potato famine, was largely avoided in areas experiencing industrialization. So, famines were more common in less industrialized areas. Socialists and communists, however, view the Industrial Revolution as the further exploitation of the have-nots in society by the haves in society. Completely different way of viewing the Industrial Revolution. Workers, in their view, did not begin to share in the dramatic increase in the standard of living until the second half of the 19th century, and this was due to low wages and poor working conditions and the like. During the first century of industrialism, the wealth created went almost exclusively to the entrepreneurs, to the bourgeoisie, and the owners of capital, the middle class. Socialism as a response to the Industrial Revolution. This last section of the lecture, there are no blanks on your notes. Just pay close attention as we cover it. It's very complicated. Socialism is a big response to the Industrial Revolution and will change the political situation throughout Europe as we move through the second half of the 19th century into the 20th century. Now, causes for socialism, of course, are the desire to reorganize society, to establish cooperation and a new sense of community based on what the socialists will see as fairness. Another cause, increasing misery of the working classes, disturbed liberal thinkers like Bentham and Mill, who we'll talk about later. And they proposed a modification of laissez-faire economics. If you have absolutely no government oversight of things, exploitation occurs. So maybe we need to temper free enterprise with a little bit of government regulation of businesses. Liberal practices in politics, like republicanism, meaning wanting Republican kinds of governments, representative governments, and economics, like capitalism, seem to promote selfish individualism and the fragmenting of society in the minds of the socialists. Rugged individualists that pull themselves up by their bootstraps and make a way for themselves, thinking of themselves. Some socialists would think that they were making a way for themselves at the expense of somebody else, at the expense of, or exploiting somebody else. So there's a difference of opinion here. It's not until the 19th century did the issue of social justice gain broad intellectual base and greater support, as we will see. Early French socialists first. They proposed a system of greater economic equality planned by the government. This is sometimes called utopian socialism. Called utopian socialism by later socialists because it seemed so idealistic that it was not really possible. One of the earliest of the French socialists, the utopian socialists, was Count Henri de Saint-Simon. Industrialization, aided by science, would bring a wondrous new age to Europe. Proper social organization will require the parasites, as he called them, the court, the royal court, the aristocracy, the lawyers, the churchmen, or the clergy, if you will, to give way to the, quote, doers, leading scientists, engineers, and industrialists, as well as the... Louis Blanc was another individual known as a utopian socialist. The more practical approach, he took a more practical approach than other early French socialists, and that's largely because he's come from a later time period. The years were 1811 to 1882. He urged workers to fight for universal suffrage, meaning everyone gets the vote, and to take control of the state peacefully. He believed the government should set up workshops and factories to guarantee full employment rather than it being done by individuals or bourgeoisie. The government should do it. And these ideas will play a role in what's known as the June Days Revolution in Paris in 1848. We'll talk more about the revolutions of 1848 and the June Days in a later lecture. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon wrote a book called What is Property in 1840 as an early utopian socialist. He believed property was profit stolen from the worker, who was the source of all wealth. Ultimately, these ideas will later influence Karl Marx, probably the most famous of all socialists. We'll talk more about Marx in a few moments. Charles Fourier was another utopian socialist, 1772 to 1837, from France. He sought a planned economy and socialist communities. He described a socialist utopia in mathematical detail in his writings. And he worked to create 7 different utopian communities. They were founded along his ideas. Most of them were done in the United States. He was an early proponent of the total emancipation of women as well. The majority of these utopian communities will falter in the long run. Robert Owen, who we discussed earlier, was a Scottish industrialist who worked in England. After 1815, he experimented with utopian cooperative socialist communities as the business owner himself. His and other unionization efforts failed, and the British labor movement moved once again after 1851 in the direction of craft unions, as I said. But he started the ball rolling. Christian socialism began in England around 1848. They believed the evils of industrialism would be ended by following Christian principles. Rather than exploiting your neighbor, love your neighbor, care for your neighbor, love your neighbor as yourself should be the focus. They attempted to bridge the gap between the anti-religious socialism and the Christian social justice for workers. Now we have Friedrich Engels, 1820 to 1895. He's one of the first of what we will call socialists, if you will, like communist socialists. He lashed out at the middle classes in his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, that was published in 1844. The future revolutionary and colleague of Karl Marx is who Friedrich Engels was. He believed the capitalist middle class ruthlessly exploited the proletariat. And just like Karl Marx, who, like I say, is his colleague, he will lash out against those capitalists. He said, and I quote, "I charge the English middle classes with mass murder, wholesale robbery, and all the other crimes in the calendar." His ideas about how the bourgeoisie, factory owners, capitalists were exploiting the working class poor will influence eventually Marx and later socialists. Now, let's talk about Marx. Marx's ideas are oftentimes referred to as scientific socialism because he separates his ideas, his and Friedrich Engels' ideas about socialism from what the earlier socialists had come up with. In some cases, that's why the early socialists are referred to as utopian socialists, meaning that their ideas were based on pie in the sky idealism of what could create a, quote, perfect society, rather than using scientific facts about human nature and about the economy as the basis for their reasoning for socialism. Marx's ideas known as scientific socialism, or sometimes communism, are what we're going to talk about now. Of course, it all is incorporated in the revolutionary book written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, the Communist Manifesto, published in 1848, another very important year in European history, not just because of the Communist Manifesto being published, but also because of a series of revolutions that will take place throughout Europe that is covered in another lecture. The Communist Manifesto is considered the Bible of communism. It intended to replace the utopian hopes and dreams of the utopian socialists with a militant blueprint for socialist working class success. It was based on what is known as the theory of dialectical materialism. Basically, that means the economic interpretation of history. Marx claimed that all human history was determined by economic factors, mainly who controls the means of production and the distribution of goods. The class struggle, he said, that pushed society through the different eras of history. Class struggle determined all history, and it was that those class struggles were always based on economic factors. History was determined by class struggles based on economics. The class struggles, he argued, since the beginning of time, there had been class struggles between the rich and the poor, or the exploiters and the exploited. He also, in his book, documented what he saw as the theory of surplus value when it came to the value of a commodity or a good. He argued that the true value of a product is the labor that was put into it to make it a valuable product. Okay? And since the worker who puts that labor into creating that product only receives a small portion of the profit from that labor, the difference when that product is sold at market, that it does not go to the worker to pay his wage, that surplus value ultimately, Marx argued, was stolen from the person who provided that value. It was stolen by the capitalist or the bourgeoisie, the factory owner. Let me explain this in a different way. Sometimes this theory of surplus value is also known as the labor theory of value. And basically, this is what this means. A product is not considered valuable or worth anything until labor is applied to make it. For example, wood, in its natural state, a tree, only has potential value. It has the potential to be made into something useful to human beings, to be consumed by humans. Okay? Once the worker takes the wood, applies labor to it, making it into something, say a table, something of value, say a table, that work that was applied, or the labor that was applied to the wood, is what made that wood have value now as a table. As just wood by itself, it had potential value. But now that it's been made into something that can be consumed or used, it now has real value. What transferred the wood from having only potential value to having real value was the work that was applied to the wood by the worker, or the labor that was applied. So, the theory of surplus value means that the value of a product is actually given to the product by the labor applied. Since the worker is the one that provides that labor to make that product valuable,
it makes sense, according to Marx, that they should receive the majority of the profits from that product. But they don't. Instead, they are given a menial wage, and the majority of the value that product creates is stolen by the factory owner or the capitalist. The capitalist or factory owner does not apply any labor to the wood, but he sells the wood in the marketplace by selling the table, and he takes that profit, stealing it from the worker. He does not provide any work that creates the value, yet he steals the profit from that surplus value. I hope this makes sense. We'll talk about it in class more if you have questions. So, this was sort of the basis, the kernel of Marx's entire argument. He said ultimately socialism was inevitable. It was going to happen in society over time because capitalism is in and of itself contains the seeds of its own destruction. Capitalism eventually leads to overproduction and unemployment, and that will eventually lead to violent revolution from the proletariat or the working class. The increasing gap between the proletariat or the workers and the bourgeoisie or the capitalist / factory owner will be so great that the working class will eventually have nothing to lose, and they will rise up in revolution and overthrow the elite bourgeoisie. After doing that, the workers, the proletariat, will create what is known as the, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat. And a direct quote from Marx's book, the final phrase in the Communist Manifesto is, "Working men of all countries unite." This will ultimately lead to the creation of a classless society. This will result as modern capitalism is dismantled. The idea of classes means that one class is designated as having more than another. If you remove the idea of property ownership, you remove the idea of class. So once you have destroyed the idea of ownership of property, you then have destroyed the idea of class. And once classes are gone, everything else in society that has been created to keep the classes separate disappears as well, including the state itself. The idea of a classless society, again, a quote from Marx, is "from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs." Now, like I say, we'll discuss this a little bit more in class to make sure you understand it. It's an interesting and sometimes difficult concept for us to understand living in America that is a capitalist country. But I will address any questions that you have in class. Now, Marxism is an atheistic philosophy. Marx saw religion as one of the things created by society to keep the masses in a subservient role to the bourgeoisie. That religion and fear of retaliation by the creator kept people in line, and that people, the upper classes, used that to their advantage to keep the lower classes subservient to them. So we'll talk more about how Marx saw religion as, quote, the opiate of the people, to keep them pacified, if you will. The impact of socialism on European politics became very profound by the late 19th century. And in some ways, we can see how this concept of socialism especially after Marx's book was published. This concept of socialism will change the way we see politics forever. Even if the communist revolution, as Marx envisioned it, the inevitability that it was just going to happen, even if it has never happened in the way he said it would, the influence of his ideas is clear. As more and more people are given the right to vote in constitutional societies, the working class, as more and more of them are given the right to vote, they are demanding different things from their government than the bourgeoisie did. They want government regulation of industry. They want the right to create unions. They want a guaranteed minimum wage that is mandated by the government. They want a guaranteed minimum or maximum work hour week. These are socialist ideas that will eventually be incorporated into regular modern politics. And it will change the idea of, quote, liberal and, quote, conservative forever. Because both liberal parties and conservative parties are both going to have to embrace certain socialist principles in order to gain the votes of the lower classes as they are given the right to vote, if they want to maintain their position in power in the legislatures. Again, we'll talk more about this specifically in class later. Marxism, like I said, had different views on women as well. Marx saw women as being doubly oppressed by capitalists that paid them low wages and exploited their labor, and by a society that gave women second-class status. He argued that women were oftentimes hired by employers because they could pay them less. They could justify paying them less than paying a man. Women eventually played an influential role in the socialist movement worldwide in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Oftentimes, the women's rights movements incorporated some of the socialist ideas that come from Marx, not all of them, but some of them, in their agenda. And we'll talk more about that with the suffragette movements that happen in places like England and France, and of course the United States as well, as we move forward into the 20th century. The last slide here is a visual showing you the impact of the Industrial Revolution. As you see, the Industrial Revolution brings about a great number of changes in society. Urbanization, a new class structure where you have the middle class or bourgeoisie in control of the working class or proletariat. Altered gender roles as well. And then you see responses to the Industrial Revolution. Okay, you see the response to socialism, unionization, demands for reform like the Factory Act and the Mines Act that we talked about. This visual we can address more in class as well to sum up the Industrial Revolution. The poor laws is something we will also talk about in class. And also, of course, demands for suffrage with the suffragette movement, especially for women and for the lower classes. Chartists and the Reform Bill of 1832 will be discussed in a later lecture as well, so we'll come back to this visual later.